travel through or live in eastern Washington, you're probably familiar with the seemingly never-ending basalts that cover this portion of the state. But did you know that not all basalt is the same? It varies by thickness, composition, structural features. In this series, I'm going to highlight the features of these basalts that make them unique. Because if you live in eastern Washington, you better know a basalt. I'm here at the Snake River next to the Lower Monumental Dam to look at the Lower Monumental Basalt. Along the road leading to the Lower Monumental Dam is an exposure of the Lower Monumental member of the Saddle Mountains Basalt. The Saddle Mountains Basalt encompasses the waning periods of the Columbia River Flood Basalt Group, and the Saddle Mountains erupted between about 17 and 5.5 million years ago. And the Lower Monumental behind me is sort of the last gasp of the Columbia River Flood basalts at that 5.5 million year mark. The Lower Monumental member is one of the smallest flood basalt units, encompassing only about 15 cubic kilometers of basalt. 15 cubic kilometers is actually quite a lot of volume, and it's about the same amount that was erupted by Locke in 1783. To put it another way, there would still be enough volume to pave I-90 all the way from Seattle to Spokane, shoulder to shoulder, 150 feet across, in about a half a mile of basalt. But you won't find the Lower Monumental Basalt anywhere near Spokane. In southeast Washington, it's confined to the present-day Snake River Canyon, only extending as far west as the Lower Monumental Dam, which I think is its namesake. It also only appears as isolated outcrops along the Snake River. To characterize the Lower Monumental member, let's take a look at one of these pieces that fell off a while ago. Break a new surface, and need a nice big surface to look at. And I'll zoom in a little more. And what we have here is a very dark apheric basalt. Not in the sun, so I don't know if there's anything that would any crystals that would wink at you in the sunlight. But looking at it here, I'm not seeing anything. And occasionally there may be some small plagioclase laths that are tabular, and any olivine or pyroxene tend to be rounded and small. Looking at a map today, it's easy to think that the Lower Monumental Basalt partly filled the Snake River Canyon, and then the Snake River took over again and cut down through the basalt. However, that's not quite what happened. We know that there was a river here when the Lower Monumental partially filled the valley. How do we know that? Well, underneath the basalt, there are these non-basaltic rocks. They're rounded with bimodal sorting. Bimodal because they're sand-sized particles in between the larger cobbles, and importantly, they're rounded and pretty well in there. They're rounded because they were transported in a river. These river rocks are also part of the Lower Monumental member, and they represent a quiet time in southeast Washington between the Lower Monumental Basalt and the next oldest flow, the Ice Harbor member, which is about 3 million years older. That unconformity is something to keep in mind when looking out over the vast Columbia basalts. There's more than just basalt to be found out there. One thing I hope you notice, and they're very red. There's a little bit of iron staining in here, but the cobbles themselves are quite red. And that's because they were brought in by the Salmon River and not the Snake. 5 million years ago, the Snake wasn't even in Washington. The Salmon River followed this canyon, or one very similar to it, traveling from Lewiston to the Tri-Cities. And 5 million years ago, the Snake was still down in Oregon, cutting across what is today the Blue Mountains, or at least that's the current theory. It wasn't until the Blue Mountains uplifted and shoved the Snake River north that the Snake captured the salmon and took over the canyon. Putting it all together, the Lower Monumental member encompasses these old river deposits from the Salmon River, and then there's a layer of likely pelaginite and very vesiculated and very broken up rocks due to the flash steaming of whatever river was in this canyon at the time. And above that is the colonnade, which is relatively small, and then that transitions into a thin entablature on top. I don't believe this is the full extent of the Lower Monumental member, but it is one of the better outcrops, which I think is why it was characterized next to the Lower Monumental Dam. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this. There's over 300 units in the Columbia River flood basalt, so we have a lot of work to do. But I hope you can say, there's a train going by. I don't know why it's going off. There's literally nothing else out here for it to honk at. But I hope you enjoyed today's adventure to the Lower Monumental Dam and the Lower Monumental Basalt behind me. There's over 300 units in the Columbia River flood basalts, and I hope you'll join me next time as we get to better know a basalt.